In 1952, researchers at Indiana University recorded that 26% of married women had never seen their husband fully undressed. The bedrooms had lights. The issue was something else. The perfect 1950s housewife existed in two versions. One wore pearls while vacuuming, greeted her husband at the door with a cocktail, and kept the children quiet during his evening rest. The other followed a different manual entirely, one that was never discussed at Bridge Club but was transmitted through wedding night pamphlets, doctor's office consultations, and the whispered advice of older married women. Marriage manuals of the era sold in the millions. Dr. Eustace Chesser's Love Without Fear moved 3 million copies by 1954. Maxine Davis's The Sexual Responsibility of Woman was required reading in premarital counseling sessions offered by churches across the country. These books didn't suggest, they instructed. An average manual contained between 40 and 60 explicit directives for wives regarding marital intimacy. What to wear, when to refuse, how to position oneself, what never to say aloud. None of this was optional. The rules were presented as medical fact, moral imperative, and the foundation of a stable home. Dr. Marie Stopes, whose Married Love remained a bestseller 2 decades after publication, wrote that a wife's gracious yielding prevented male neurosis and guaranteed domestic peace. Popular Mechanics, in a 1954 sidebar on The Modern Home, listed a wife's availability among household maintenance tasks, right between checking the furnace filter and rotating seasonal clothing. A 1953 survey of 2,400 married women conducted by Red Book magazine found that 78% believed a wife's primary marital duty was physical availability, regardless of personal inclination. When asked whether a wife could refuse her husband without cause, 82% answered no. The survey didn't ask whether refusal damaged a marriage. It asked whether refusal constituted grounds for fault in divorce proceedings. Behind the bedroom door lay a set of unspoken rules as rigid as any etiquette guide. Expectations that were rarely discussed in daylight, but universally understood after dark. 10 specific rules, repeated across dozens of manuals with only minor variation in wording, covered everything from physical availability to emotional performance, from what a wife should see to what she should never, under any circumstances, say. The manual sat on nightstands in 14 million American homes. Dr. Eustace Chesser's Love Without Fear, published in 1940, with U.S. editions appearing in 1947 and reprinted 23 times by 1955, devoted Chapter 7 to what it termed the wife's continuous obligation. The chapter opened not with philosophy, but with a schedule. 7 days per week. No provisions for illness, exhaustion, or personal preference. The medical term used throughout was conjugal debt, a financial metaphor applied to physical availability. A debt that could never be paid off, only serviced on demand. Rule 1 appeared in every marriage manual surveyed between 1950 and 1959. The wording varied slightly, but the directive remained identical. A wife must be available whenever her husband desired, regardless of circumstance. The American Medical Association's 1952 Marriage Manual for Physicians framed this as preventive medicine. Refusal, the text explained, could lead to male frustration, which could lead to infidelity, which could destroy the family unit. The causal chain was presented as biological fact rather than social construction. Obligation, not desire, drove the mechanism. Dr. Paul Popenoe, director of the American Institute of Family Relations, wrote in a 1953 Ladies' Home Journal column that a wife who refused her husband more than twice per month was engaging in marital malpractice. The column ran alongside advertisements for refrigerators and gelatin molds. Popenoe's institute counseled more than 1,000 couples a year. His advice reached 4.7 million subscribers. Rule 2 arrived as a corollary: perpetual physical presentation. A wife's appearance could never lapse, even in private. The specific instructions appeared in The Art of Marriage by Tim and Beverly LaHaye, which sold 2.5 million copies. Chapter 4 contained a checklist: hairstyled, makeup applied, attractive nightwear selected, all before the husband arrived home. The book specified that a wife should never be seen in curlers, cold cream, or anything resembling practical sleepwear. This went beyond daytime presentation. Several manuals instructed wives to wake before their husbands to apply makeup, then return to bed to simulate natural awakening. The effort required to appear effortlessly attractive was never acknowledged as effort. The performance had to erase its own rehearsal. 364 women surveyed in a 1956 Red Book study reported that they had never spoken aloud about intimate relations with anyone outside the marriage. Not their mothers, not their sisters, not their closest friends. The silence wasn't preference, it was enforcement. Rule 3. A wife did not discuss what happened behind the bedroom door. Not the mechanics, not the frequency, not her own feelings about any of it. Marriage manuals framed this silence as protection of the husband's dignity and the marriage's sanctity. Dr. Paul Popenoe's Modern Marriage devoted an entire chapter to the dangers of female confidence, warning that any disclosure to friends or family members could destroy a husband's reputation and undermine his authority within the home. The penalty for breaking the rule was social annihilation. A woman known to have discussed intimate matters faced immediate exclusion from church groups, bridge clubs, neighborhood circles. One documented case from Dayton, Ohio, involved a young wife who confided discomfort to her sister. The sister mentioned it to her own husband. Within 2 weeks, the original wife's husband had been informed, her in-laws had been notified, and her standing in the community had collapsed. She and her husband relocated to another state 6 months later. If words were forbidden, questions didn't exist. A wife did not ask her husband to explain, adjust, or reconsider. Rule 4 made this explicit. She submitted to his preference and his timing, never hers. The Power of Sexual Surrender by Marie Robinson, published in 1959 and recommended by over 4,000 physicians, argued that a wife's fulfillment depended entirely on her ability to abandon personal preference. The book sold 1.8 million copies. Timing belonged exclusively to the husband. Several manuals specified that a wife should never initiate, never decline, and never indicate a preferred schedule. One widely circulated pamphlet compared the marital relationship to a pilot and co-pilot. The husband navigated, the wife supported his navigation, and any attempt by the wife to take the controls represented dangerous overreach. The phrase wifely submission appeared in 87% of marital advice literature published between 1950 and 1960. The language was clinical, the expectation absolute. Silence and submission locked together. A wife could not speak about what she experienced, and she could not influence what she experienced. The bedroom became a space where her presence was required, but her voice was not. What made a wife's obligation different from any other household duty she carried? The manuals answered with precision. Intimacy was classified as marital responsibility, assigned the same operational status as meal preparation or laundering. Dr. Marion Hilliard's 1956 manual, A Woman Doctor Looks at Love and Life, devoted Chapter 7 to what she termed conjugal obligation, describing it as a contract term requiring fulfillment regardless of inclination. The chapter ran 14 pages. The word pleasure appeared once, in a footnote disclaiming its relevance to wifely participation. Medical literature reinforced the framework. Between 1952 and 1959, 73% of gynecological textbooks used in American medical schools included sections on marital frigidity, defining it not as absence of arousal, but as failure to perform required functions. The diagnosis carried treatment protocols, hormone therapy, psychological counseling, or what one 1954 Johns Hopkins text described as reorientation toward acceptance. A factory shift supervisor clocks workers in, watches them complete assigned tasks, clocks them out. Personal satisfaction with the work is irrelevant to whether the shift counts as fulfilled. Discretion operated as enforcement. A wife was prohibited from discussing bedroom matters with anyone outside the marriage. Several denominations made this prohibition explicit in premarital counseling, framing intimate disclosure as a form of infidelity. One Presbyterian guidebook from 1957 compared a wife who discussed her marriage bed to a soldier who leaked classified intelligence. Both betrayed trust. Both damaged the institution they served. The medical profession participated. Standard intake forms at women's health clinics included a question about marital satisfaction, but clinic protocols from the period show that affirmative answers were expected, and negative answers triggered psychiatric referral rather than investigation of physical causes. A 1958 study of 5 urban clinics found that only 11% of physicians asked follow-up questions when women indicated marital difficulties. Personal desire, when acknowledged at all, was treated as dysfunction requiring correction. Complaint was categorized as maladjustment. Duty without pleasure, discretion without voice, denial without relief. The system's weight kept building. The performance script was written down. Dr. Hannah Stone's 1952 Medical Handbook for Young Wives included a checklist under the heading Marital Response Indicators: vocal affirmation, physical responsiveness, post-encounter expression of satisfaction. The text clarified that these indicators should be present regardless of personal experience or fatigue. Wives were graded on behavior, not feeling. A nurse's training manual from the same year went further. It instructed practitioners to counsel wives on appropriate demonstration of gratitude following marital relations. The recommended phrases were printed in italics. "Thank you for choosing me. I'm grateful for your attention. You make me feel wanted." The everyday analogy was hospitality. A good hostess thanked her guests for coming, even if the party exhausted her. A good wife thanked her husband for his presence, even if the encounter left her hollow. The performance had layers. First, the act itself required visible enthusiasm. Marital advice columns published reader questions. How do I show enjoyment when I feel nothing? The column responses never questioned the premise. They offered technique, controlled breathing to simulate excitement, strategic vocalization, careful timing of movement. One 1954 response suggested wives study their husband's preferences the way an actress studies a role. Second, the aftermath required expressed gratitude. A wife who rolled over silently, who rose immediately to wash, who showed relief that it was finished rather than satisfaction that it had occurred, committed a documented offense. Church counseling records from a Detroit parish show that 15 wives were referred for marital coldness between 1955 and 1958. The diagnostic criterion in 12 of those cases was failure to express appreciation. Third, the performance extended beyond the bedroom. A wife was expected to signal ongoing satisfaction to others. At social gatherings, she referenced her husband's attentiveness in conversation with other women. At family dinners, she made small, approving gestures when he spoke. In church, she sat close, smiled often, touched his arm. The performance required witnesses. A marriage was not merely experienced, it was displayed. The witnesses enforced the script. If a wife seemed distant at a dinner party, if she failed to laugh at her husband's joke, or look pleased when he placed his hand on her knee, another woman would corner her later. Is everything all right at home? The question was surveillance, dressed as concern. The expected answer was immediate reassurance. Any hesitation triggered intervention. A phone call to her mother, a word with the pastor, a suggestion that she might benefit from a visit to the doctor. The performance became reflex. One oral history from the 1990s recorded an interview with a woman then in her 70s who had been married in 1953. She described waking in the middle of the night after her husband had rolled toward her. Before she was fully conscious, she had smiled, murmured something affectionate, adjusted her position. She did not remember deciding to do it. The script had written itself into her body. The consequences of breaking script merged the medical and the social. A wife who couldn't perform enthusiasm risked being labeled frigid, a diagnosis that in the 1950s carried institutional weight. It appeared on medical records. It justified referral to psychiatric care. It could be grounds, in some states, for fault-based divorce. A wife who refused gratitude risked something worse, her husband's attention turning elsewhere. Advice literature made this threat explicit. A 1956 pastoral guide warned that the ungrateful wife drove her husband toward worldly temptations. The implication was clear. If he strayed, the failure was hers. The system assumed infinite capacity for performance. Fatigue, illness, grief, none of these exempted a wife from the script. A 1953 letter to an advice columnist described a woman recovering from a miscarriage, asking how soon she should resume normal marital relations and whether her reluctance to express enthusiasm during recovery was a sign of deeper dysfunction. The columnist's response assured her that grief was natural, then pivoted. Your husband has also suffered a loss and needs your comfort now more than ever. Comfort meant performance. Loss did not pause the expectation, it heightened it. The refusal to perform carried a charge of selfishness. A wife who said she was too tired, too sad, too unwell was accused of thinking only of herself. Her husband's needs were framed as objective and urgent. Hers were subjective and deferrable. One marriage manual from 1957 contrasted the self-centered wife who dwells on her own discomforts with the devoted wife who rises above personal feeling to meet her husband's needs. rising above personal feeling. The phrase appeared in pastoral letters, medical advice, women's magazine columns. It meant the same thing in every context. Your feelings do not count. Performance and gratitude, the final lock on the system. Not just compliance, but enthusiasm. Not just submission, but thanks. The 10th rule was the most unforgiving. Never let the children know. Bedrooms had locks, but walls were thin. Discretion extended beyond what happened to any evidence that it had happened at all. A ruffled bedspread smoothed before breakfast. A raised voice hushed mid-sentence. A wife's discomfort hidden behind the morning routine. This rule appeared nowhere in print, but it structured domestic architecture as surely as any blueprint. The master bedroom in post-war suburban homes was placed at the opposite end of the hall from the children's rooms when floor plans allowed. When they didn't, silence became spatial strategy. One 1954 housekeeping manual advised wives to schedule intimate encounters around children's sleep patterns and to keep a second set of sheets in the linen closet. The concealment wasn't only physical. Children were to grow up believing their parents' marriage was effortless, affectionate, and free of conflict. Any crack in that facade, an overheard argument, a mother's tears, a father's coldness at breakfast, was treated as a failure of wifely management. The 1950s ideal wasn't just a happy marriage. It was a marriage that looked happy at every hour, from every angle to every witness. These 10 rules produced a generation raised on a carefully staged performance. The children of the 1950s learned about marriage by watching their mothers perform compliance and their fathers accept it as given. They learned that a wife's role was to accommodate, that a husband's desires came first, that discomfort was private and gratitude was public. They learned these things not from a sermon or a textbook, but from the ordinary rhythm of a household that never named what it was teaching. The system worked because it compounded silence on silence. A wife couldn't speak about what happened behind the bedroom door. She couldn't admit dissatisfaction. She couldn't seek help without risking diagnosis. And she couldn't let her children see any of it, which meant she couldn't let herself show it. The rules didn't just govern behavior, they governed expression, and eventually, they governed memory. Women who followed them often couldn't name what they had endured even decades later. The rules began to crack in the late 1960s, but the silence persisted longer. The women who had lived under them didn't speak. Many never did. What survives instead are the artifacts, the manuals, the medical records, the advice columns that spelled out what couldn't be said aloud. Those artifacts show a system that was never accidental. It was designed, codified, and enforced across every institution that touched a marriage: medical, religious, legal, social. The unspoken rules of the 1950s bedroom were an architecture of control built on shame, obligation, and silence. They told women that their bodies were not their own, that their comfort didn't matter, that their role was performance, and the reward was security. They created marriages that looked perfect from the outside because everything broken was hidden on the inside. And they shaped an entire generation's understanding of what marriage was supposed to be. Not a partnership, but a transaction. Not intimacy, but duty. Not love, but compliance.